In the remote regions of the Rocky Mountain West, two men controlled nearly all the country's copper production. One was a ruthless banker known for preying on the misfortune of miners. The other, a self-made man with a legendary knack for knowing where to dig. Both created huge empires and lived like kings, but they fought a ferocious and often personal battle that lasted nearly 25 years. A battle that stretched from the cramped mine shafts thousands of feet below the Earth's surface to the majestic dome that towers over the nation's capital. In the early 1860s, copper was the last thing on the minds of miners, in Montana or anywhere else. Gold fever was raging. Caught and spread by the California 49ers, it had become a national epidemic. Fortune hunters by the thousands risked their lives crossing the Great Plains and perilous Rocky Mountains, chasing a dream and a fortune. Of the 100,000 miners who poured into California, most came up empty-handed, but some struck it rich, and theirs were the stories that made it back east.
The California rush of 1849 really made America go gold crazy. So much had happened out there, so many stories, so many people, fewer than people thought, but so many people got rich. It was a tremendous boom to the economy, and it awakened this greed.
If California made Americans gold crazy and greedy, it also made the nation rich. In the 10 years after gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill, $500 million in precious metal flowed back east. Gradually, California's river of gold dried up. But gold rush fever raged on. Prospectors fanned out across the West, searching for the next big strike, the new mother lode. Among the places they searched were the remote regions of western Montana. When loose flakes and nuggets called placer gold turned up in the creek beds of the mountains, boom towns like Bannock, Virginia City, and Butte were soon crawling with prospectors.
Well, the initial rush to Montana began in 1862, and it really crowned in 1863-64. So it took place right in the midst of the Civil War. It was one of the mid-sized to larger placer gold rushes.
One of the first prospectors to arrive in Montana was an Easterner named William Andrews Clark. Clark arrived with brains and ambition, but not much else.
Clark was born in a small rural farming community of Connellsville, Pennsylvania in 1839. He was the second of 11 children, so you know that they didn't have a lot of money, and he came to Montana with a pick and shovel and started panning for gold.
Clark was 24 when he arrived in Montana. He didn't waste time making friends or hanging out in the saloons and brothels that sprang up wherever miners were. He got right to work.
Well, Clark was certainly not a charismatic guy. He was once described as being about as magnetic as last year's bird's nest. That's not entirely fair to Clark. If you ever look at the pictures of Clark, though, the piercing dark eyes, the remarkable intelligence, and an ambition that was almost beyond description.
Panning for gold was arduous work. Standing in the frigid Rocky Mountain streams, sifting through tons of sand and gravel day after day, straining to see a few golden specks. Clark started panning in the summer of 1863. By fall, he'd panned $2,000 worth of gold. And for Clark, that was enough. Not enough gold, enough hard work. Clark had noticed that it wasn't the miners who were prospering off the gold rush. It was the merchants. The ones charging $100 or more for a 1-pound bag of salt.
As you can check in the history books, it was the merchant that ended up having the gold that the miners took out of the ground, and Clark is surely no exception. Actually, he's a prime example of how that did work.
He was always thinking about how he could make $1, and so even as young as 24, that's how old he was when he came. He was carrying mail, doing mail runs. He was selling supplies to the miners. Always, I think he was thinking about how he could make buck.
Clark used part of his $2,000 in gold to buy a wagon. Then he set off across the mountains for Salt Lake City, 400 miles away. 2 months later, in the dead of winter, he returned to Montana with a wagon load of eggs, all of them frozen solid. Clark sold them to hungry miners for $3 a dozen.
As long as the profit bottom line was good, the people be damned. He would take whatever the market would bear, and if a miner had to work all day for $1 and he charged him $3 for eggs, he didn't really care.
Those early merchants in the 1860s and 1870s really earned great money hauling in those precious cargoes like salt and produce and fruit and vegetables. A pound of salt could go as high as $150 in those early days.
With prices like those, Merchant Clark swiftly amassed a small fortune. In 1872, Clark used his profits from eggs and salt to open a bank in the supply town called Deer Lodge. Now, besides gouging the miners for supplies, he could gouge them for loans too.
He was kind of a small man. Maybe he had that small man problem that some men have. I don't know. I think he was kind of dapper in his clothes and fancied himself a bon vivant around town.
But while Clark was getting rich, Montana's miners were going bust. By the late 1860s, the gold was giving out, and miners were giving up. Clark began snapping up mines for pennies on the dollar. His timing couldn't have been better. Gold wasn't the only precious metal buried in the Montana hills. On a hillside above Silver Bow Creek in Butte, a persistent miner named William Farland had spied an unusual outcropping of granite. Farland suspected the granite might be hiding something else.
Farland was one of the first people to take the outcroppings to an assayer, and ultimately when it broke down, it proved to be very rich in silver.
Farland named his new silver mine the Travona, and it proved chock full of silver. But extricating the precious metal required facilities that didn't exist in Butte or anywhere within hundreds of miles. Farland needed an ore mill to crush his ore and get the silver out. And he needed a loan to build that mill. Hat in hand, Farland paid a call on a local banker. The banker, of course, was William Clark.
He went to a man he'd met in the goldfields, W.A. Clark, and went and borrowed money from the Clark and Larrabee Bank down in Deer Lodge to get started. Clark knew that Farland was a good miner.
Clark agreed to the loan, but demanded the Travona as collateral. Farland hesitated. Then Clark made an offer. He would hire Farland to mill ore from one of Clark's mines. With that money, Farland could repay the loan. Farland signed. He figured he couldn't lose. He couldn't have been more wrong. Clark never sent his ore to the mill, and Farland soon found himself behind on his loan payments. He asked Clark for an extension. Clark, of course, turned him down.
When Farland asked him for a extension in the loan, of course it was sure.
Farland did not pay back the banker. And when you don't pay the banker back, they usually kind of end up with whatever you put up for collateral.
W.A. Clark would pounce when he saw the opportunity to make money. He didn't think twice about foreclosing on Farland.
In one cold-blooded move, William Clark now owned Butte's best silver mine and the only mill in town. From his humble beginnings panning for gold flakes, he was becoming one of the richest and most powerful men in the West, and Butte was his undisputed kingdom. But all that was about to change. When we return, a new miner and a new metal show up in Butte, and the battle for the richest hill on earth begins. By the 1870s, the mountain mines of the American West were pouring forth rivers of gold and silver. The Colorado gold fields proved even richer than California's, and Nevada's Comstock lode contained a king's ransom of both gold and silver. All it took to get rich was a knack for knowing where to dig. But not many miners actually had that knack. One man who did was Marcus Daly. Daly was an Irishman, one of thousands who fled starvation during the Irish potato famine. When he got off the boat in New York in 1856, he was 15, poor, and uneducated.
Daly, all through his life, bore the marks of his peasant background. He was stooped. He had great trouble with the language, both speaking it and writing it. Caused some people to dismiss him as being slow-witted. Actually, he was very intelligent.
Unlike William Clark, who hated hard labor, Daly embraced it. He worked for 5 years in New York as a dockhand, a stable hand, and a leather worker. He scrimped and saved to buy passage by steamer to San Francisco. In the mines of California, his first job was hauling buckets of water to the toiling miners. As they talked with the hard-working young immigrant, the other miners soon noticed something different about Daly. He could tell somehow where they should dig to hit pay dirt. Daly, it seemed, had a nose for mining.
We believe here in mining places that mining people are born, they're not made. Marcus Daly was a true miner. He understood mining.
In 1862, Daly left California for Nevada and the Comstock mines. In the booming hills around Virginia City, Daly teamed up with George Hearst, a miner who had struggled in California but was finally striking it rich. The Hearst family would later become famous for its publishing empire, but in the 1860s, George Hearst was still a mining man.
Well, Hearst and Daly were quite a lot alike. Hearst was like Daly. You could find Hearst or Daly sitting on a curbstone, talking with their men, sharing a chew of tobacco. Hearst was notoriously unkempt, called Uncle George. He made fortunes and lost fortunes. Both of them really made their big start on the Comstock lode in Nevada.
In the hills outside Salt Lake City, Utah, Daly steered Hearst to a silver claim called the Ontario. Hearst bought it and put Daly in charge of developing it. Under Daly's management, the Ontario soon became the richest silver mine in the world.
He made Hearst a great deal of money by nosing out mining properties, by being able to explain how to purchase mining properties and how to tell whether they were going to hold the mother lode or not.
The Ontario made George Hearst a multimillionaire. It made Marcus Daly a legend among miners.
It used to be said of Daly he could see into the ground farther than any other man that anyone knew. And it was that really was the genesis, as I understand it, of the Hearst fortune. Hearst had made money before, but this silver mine at Ontario was the big break.
In 1876, the same year William Clark foreclosed on the Trevona silver mine and its ore mill, Marcus Daly came to Butte. As usual, Daly was looking for promising mining claims. This time, though, he wasn't working for George Hearst. Daly had been hired by the Walker brothers, wealthy bankers from Salt Lake City. His assignment was to check out a Butte silver deposit called the Rainbow Lode. Daly's arrival caused quite a stir in Butte.
Everybody knew this was a prestigious mine appraiser, investor, and manager. So when Daly comes to town representing the wealthy Walker bankers from Salt Lake City, Butte is very glad to see him.
Not everyone in Butte was glad to see Daly, particularly William Clark.
The Butte community worshipped Daly because he represented big money from the outside. My guess is that Clark didn't particularly care for Daly because of his immigrant Catholic background, but probably more so because he was getting more of the limelight than Mr. Clark was.
At Daly's urging, the Walker brothers snapped up a mine on the Rainbow Lode called the Alice Mine, a mine that Clark himself had been eyeing. The Walkers also gave Daly a small share of the mine and asked him to run it. William Clark was furious. He wasted no time letting Daly know he was unwelcome in Butte. Clark owned a claim directly uphill from the Alice. He ordered his miners to dig tunnels right alongside Daly's, but a few strategic feet higher.
Clark left his mine higher, his working areas of his mine higher than that of the Alice, so that the waters from his properties would drain into the Alice mine anyway, and they'd be responsible for pumping them and increasing the cost of their production in that area.
Soon, water was pouring down from Clark's tunnels and flooding Daly's. But Daly wasn't one to let a little sabotage stop him. He installed massive pumps to drain the water and kept right on shipping silver to the Walkers.
The Walker brothers are processing silver worth millions. It's been coming out pure silver bars practically from the ground, and these guys are making millions of dollars with very little investment.
The legend of Daly's golden touch, or in this case, silver touch, grew even stronger. But so did William Clark's resolve to drive him from Butte. What happened next, though, would keep Daly in Montana forever. Tucked into an unusual outcropping of black granite high on Butte Hill was a small silver mine called the Anaconda. Daly's sixth sense told him it was something special.
He has a nose for mining. He knows mining in his bones. He's been telling the big boys where to buy their mining property for a long time. So when he sees this Anaconda mine, he knows it's good.
Supposedly, it was almost an afterthought that he went and looked at the Anaconda mine and bought it. We honestly do not know whether he took it to the Walkers. My guess is that he didn't, because he certainly broke with them, and they resented him, hated him after that day.
Daly bought the Anaconda and a neighboring claim for $30,000. After years of running other men's mines, Daly finally owned a mine of his own. Unfortunately, he'd spent every cent he had just buying the Anaconda. The expensive part was yet to come.
The investment in the mine is only the beginning. One needs capital for a stamping mill, for smelting, whether you build your own smelter or have it custom smelted for you. So Daly did not have that kind of money.
But Daly knew someone who did, his old pal George Hearst. Daly had made millions for Hearst. Surely Hearst could spare a bit of that fortune. Daly went to Hearst and asked for backing. With a little bit of investment, Daly promised, the Anaconda could pay off big. But Daly wasn't the only one who came calling on Hearst to discuss the Anaconda. Hot on the heels of Marcus Daly came William Clark.
Clark knew that Daly would be his biggest competitor, and that if he could stop him there, he would have it all. So Clark tried to undermine Daly at that point and told Hearst Daly was not the man he thought he was, that he wouldn't be able to develop the mine, that he wasn't as good as he was presenting himself.
But Hearst had evidence to the contrary, millions of dollars worth of evidence. Hearst hadn't forgotten that it was Daly who found him his fortune.
Marcus Daly and George Hearst are two men who understand mining. And I think they had a lot of respect for each other. And I think when Clark came, maybe Hearst questioned a little bit of what was going on.
Hearst showed William Clark the door and wrote Daly a check. Daly no longer owned the Anaconda outright. Hearst and his partners now owned a sizable share of the mine. But now Daly could tap the deep pockets of one of America's great fortunes. Money in hand, Daly began to dig. But it soon started to look like Daly's legendary nose for riches might be failing him. By 1880, with the engine of American prosperity gathering steam, the mining rivalry between Marcus Daly and William Clark was heating up. Daly had bet everything he had on the Anaconda mine. He'd also persuaded millionaire George Hearst to bankroll equipment and a workforce. But the deeper Daly's men dug, the less silver they found.
Once they started running out of silver ore, the mine almost looked worthless. As you come to the end of a vein that's an economic vein, you have a couple of choices. Obviously, you can go out of business, or you can start looking around to see if you can find some more of the similar type of ore. But as you come to the end of the veins or the economic ore, you're going to go broke if you keep going. So you start getting a little bit panicked about what you're going to do.
Clark watched with smug satisfaction as Daly poured more and more money down the empty mine shaft.
The rumor was that they sank $4 million, a huge amount, in those days into the Anaconda before they ever took a penny out of it.
But Daly refused to give Clark the satisfaction of giving up. Daly told his men to keep digging, and dig they did. 100 feet, 150, 200, 250, 300 feet down. Daly's miners finally struck something, but it wasn't silver. It was copper.
They were down there blasting, and some of his miners came up and said, "There's some new material here." But Daly knew what it was. He'd seen copper before, and the minute he saw that, he realized that they had hit a massive vein of mid-range copper ore.
The deeper they went, the less the silver and the higher the copper. He gets into an ore body of copper sulfide that is so pure and so rich that to date, there had never been that kind of a find in any mine in America.
Of course, back then, no one was looking for copper. Copper was the stuff of church roofs, brass buttons, pots and pans. Silver and gold were where the money was. But Daly's timing was perfect.
And at the exact same time, the United States of America is starting to take interest in a guy named Edison, who has invented a light bulb. And so what you have going on here is telegraph, telephone, electricity, and all of a sudden there's this need for a conductor of this electricity. And they find gold is too expensive, silver isn't quite as good, but copper, golly, that's the metal they need.
Suddenly, America couldn't get enough copper. Utility companies, phone companies, and wire manufacturers clamored for copper, and Marcus Daly had more than anyone else. The Anaconda mine became the Anaconda Company, a fast-growing empire sprawling across Butte Hill. Hundreds of miners worked day and night, burrowing deep into the mountain of copper. Surprisingly, while demand increased, copper prices actually dropped. Michigan Copper Mines, America's previous leader in production, cut prices to compete with Montana from 20 cents a pound to just 10 cents a pound. But Montana's mines were too big to beat now. Butte's population skyrocketed. With Daly and Clark competing for workers, wages were good. Nearly $3 a day, the best mining pay in America. True, the work was difficult and dangerous. A Butte miner's life expectancy was just 38 years.
The deep mines were very dangerous places. The dangers were of lung-based diseases, silicosis, inhaling dust laden with metal from the mines, tuberculosis, and of course the ever-present danger of terrible mine disasters, whether they'd be fires or explosions or cave-ins.
But the pay was irresistible. Miners flocked to Butte by the thousands from all over America and throughout Europe, too.
Englishmen, Irishmen, people from Wales. There were Scandinavians, Swedish, Norwegian, and they were hoping to find the American dream.
The copper boom blew Butte wide open, transforming it from a sleepy mining camp to a full-fledged industrial city. It was brimming with miners who worked hard and drank even harder.
Butte had some of the epic bars. The Atlantic Bar was a city block long. It went 24 hours a day. And if you kept drinking, there was all the pork and the eggs and everything that you would like to eat. They celebrated the fact that they never closed, often by simply taking the key on opening day and dropping it down the toilet to show the doors here would never be locked.
The good times weren't limited to the bars. One of the biggest, wildest red light districts in America sprang up in Butte.
one house of prostitution called the Bullpen that supposedly worked hundreds of prostitutes. It roared night and day, 3 8-hour shifts endlessly rotating. So when one shift was underground, the other would be up above ground playing.
The owners of the mining companies were very interested in keeping the miners happy. They didn't necessarily want them to unionize, and they felt that if the miners had sex and they had alcohol, that this would keep them, this first of all would keep them impoverished, because every time they got a paycheck, they'd spend it at the whorehouse or at the saloon. So their whole paycheck went back into the community.
And in many cases into William Clark's pockets. As Butte grew, so did the value of Clark's claims. Through a holding company called the Colorado and Montana Company, plus a growing network of mines and processing facilities, Clark began tapping his silver mines for copper too. As Clark and Daly's production soared, so did their fortunes. But those fortunes did nothing to distract them from their bitter rivalry. Daly hadn't forgotten Clark's scheme to flood the Alice mine, or his effort to turn George Hearst against him. In the spring of 1883, Daly summoned George Hearst and his other financial partners to Butte. Daly had a plan to turn the Anaconda Company into a colossus that would leave Clark far behind.
Daly in 1883 brought them to the top of the Butte Hill from California, and he explained a rather very outlandish proposal to them, and that was that they go 26 miles to the west of Butte, build the world's largest copper smelter in that particular area, and eventually build a railroad to connect the two communities.
Daly wanted to erect not only the world's largest copper smelter, but an entire city built from the ground up. The city's sole purpose would be to keep the huge smelter running day and night. Daly had it all figured out, right down to the city's name. He would call it Anaconda. Hearst and his partners told Daly he could count on them for whatever he needed. Soon an army of workers swarmed across the valley floor. They built hundreds of houses. They cut millions of board feet of timber to build the mighty smelter. In just 1 year, Daly's town and smelter became a reality. Later, he would lay a 26-mile rail line to feed more and more ore to the smelter.
When you look at what Daly did, he built a smelter, he built the community of Anaconda, he built a water system to feed the smelter, he built a railroad from Butte to Anaconda to take the ore to the smelter. It's incredible.
In 1887, Daly and the Anaconda turned out 57 million pounds of copper, more than 3 times Clark's total. But Daly's triumph was short-lived. Months later, disaster struck. The immense wooden smelter complex, sprawling across an area the size of several city blocks, caught fire. As the townspeople watched in horror, the vast smelter burned to the ground. The fire looked suspicious, and many fingers pointed in the direction of Daly's rival, William Clark. When we return, Daly stands amid the ruins, and Clark aims to complete his victory. By the late 1880s, America's second industrial revolution was going strong, powered not by steam, but by electricity. Much of the electricity ran on copper from the Montana mines of Marcus Daly and William Clark. A half-mile underground, legions of miners toiled for a few dollars a day to keep the metal flowing for the rival tycoons.
What made it so valuable now was as a conductor of electricity and for the communications industry. So it's the spreading use of electricity, which is mushrooming in the 80s and 90s, and of the telephone industry at the same time, that now have massive new uses for copper. And the value of the metal is zooming, and America is the world leader in copper during these years. And Butte quickly surpasses Michigan to become the leading American producer of copper.
Self-made Irish immigrant Marcus Daly had scored a coup in 1884, firing up the world's largest copper smelter. But in 1888, Daly's smelter lay in charred ruins. The entire facility had mysteriously caught fire and burned to the ground. Suspicion fell on William Clark, but there was no proof. A weaker man might have given up, but to Marcus Daly, that was unthinkable. Daly ordered his men to rebuild the smelter. This time, he made it fireproof. 1 year after the disastrous fire, the Anaconda smelter, bigger and better than ever, was once more the world's leading source of copper. 80 miles west of Anaconda, in Hamilton, far from the smoky smelter stacks, Daly and his wife began building a 20,000-acre estate. The Dalys and their 4 children moved in 1889, but moved out temporarily in 1897 to remodel the home to make it more conducive to entertaining. Daly named the mansion and grounds Bitterroot Farms. But Daly's rival, William Clark, wasn't exactly living in squalor either. Clark occupied a lavish mansion of his own high on the side of Butte Hill. His wife, Clark's childhood sweetheart Catherine, was hardly ever there though. She and Clark's children preferred the salons of Europe to the rough and tumble environs of Montana. Both Clark and Daly lived like kings, modeling their lives after the example of robber barons like the Vanderbilts and the Morgans.
Clark spent $260,000 building this house. That was an enormous amount of money in those days. He invited European artists and craftsmen to come and work on the house. Many of the ceilings, you'll notice, are hand-painted fresco ceilings. The beautiful glass windows in the mansion, one just above me is 17 feet tall, all made of stained glass. An amazing thing.
Comfortably ensconced in their mansions, the two rivals might have chosen to make peace with each other. Instead, their feud was about to explode into all-out war. In 1888, the same year Daly's smelter burned to the ground, the people of Montana were about to elect their first delegate to the U.S. Congress. And in William Clark's humble opinion, there was only one man for the job, the Democratic candidate, William Clark. Daly, like Clark, was a Democrat too, but he immediately threw his wealth and power behind Clark's Republican opponent. His sudden conversion to Republicanism wasn't due solely to his rivalry with Clark, though. Daly's men had illegally cut thousands of acres of government-owned timber. The government was suing. Daly was hoping a sympathetic congressman might get him off the hook.
Daly and his co-investors were eager to have a Republican representing them, hopefully to a Republican administration in Washington. So it would appear that Daly and his allies undercut Clark, even though they were all Democrats, mainly for hard, practical business reasons.
Daly didn't stop with merely endorsing Clark's opponent. When Election Day rolled around, Daly's foremen collected ballots from thousands of Anaconda workers. Then Daly's men inspected the ballots to make sure they were filled out correctly. Clark lost by 5,000 votes.
Clark never forgave or forgot what Daly and his associates did to him in 1888, and he was determined to get revenge in any way he could.
5 years later, Clark ran for the Senate. Daly stopped him the same way he had before. Clark vowed to get even, and soon he saw a golden opportunity. In 1894, Marcus Daly launched a campaign to move Montana's state capital from Helena to Anaconda. Clark threw all of his weight and much of his money behind Helena.
Daly wanted Anaconda, I think, for the very simple, sentimental reason that it was his town, his company town, so to speak.
Clark made fun of Daly's town. He made fun of the fact that it was a blue-collar town and that people weren't as sophisticated.
Clark's forces handed out cold, hard cash to anyone who would agree to vote against Anaconda. When the votes were tallied, Clark's side had won by 1,800 votes.
When Clark's train came into Helena that night, Victory Night, He was brought into town in a carriage. The people unhooked the horses and pulled the carriage into the downtown area, Last Chance Gulch, by hand. The main bars in Helena were opened on his tab, supposedly $30,000. That would buy a lot of alcohol in 1894. So this unlovable man, for this one time in his life, he was loved.
Emboldened by his victory with Helena, Clark decided to make another bid for the U.S. Senate in 1898. Clark knew better than to count on winning the votes. This time he'd play it safe and buy the votes.
There was rumors that bags of cash were being tossed around like crazy over transoms and in the back rooms. And there were a lot of people who obviously made off real well.
They tell some very peculiar stories about where that wealth came from. Some guy suddenly can buy a ranch or a sawmill, and you find out in a few cases that either Clark or some Clark bank or partner is suddenly become his business partner.
Soon Daly got his checkbook out. Daly wasn't running for office himself, but he was determined to stop Clark at any cost. In the days before soft money and pollsters, Daly and Clark were locked in an escalating battle to outspend one another.
In the 1899-1900 Senate race, which I usually talk about being the fourth major battle between William Andrews Clark and Marcus Daly, I do believe that William Andrews Clark admitted to spending over $430,000 on buying votes in the Montana State Legislature.
I think that they probably went $2 million easy in bribery.
When we return, the votes are in. The 25-year feud between William Clark and Marcus Daly ends, but not without one more big surprise. In the winter of 1899, William Clark and Marcus Daly were locked in a ferocious battle to buy votes. At stake was a U.S. Senate seat that Clark had been coveting for a decade.
It was common in those days for millionaires to want to establish themselves in almost Roman fashion as a United States senator. And here was W.A. Clark, the richest man in his state, who thought that readily translated into politics. He felt that it was his natural right, and I think society tended to agree that that probably was his natural right.
On January 28, 1899, the votes were counted. William A. Clark, one-time miner, price-gouging merchant, and cutthroat financier, was now Senator William A. Clark. Clark's hard work and open pocketbook had not only bought a U.S. Senate seat, it also bought a satisfying measure of revenge on Marcus Daly. His triumph over his rival looked complete. But while Clark was openly working on buying votes, Daly had been secretly working on selling the Anaconda. In April of 1899, the story broke like a bombshell. Daly was selling the entire Anaconda operation for the staggering sum of $39 million. The buyers had ties to a family-run business back east. The business was Standard Oil, and the family was named Rockefeller.
When you think about Standard Oil actually buying Anaconda, you're looking at something like AOL buying Time Warner. This is a major event, and the money is very comparable. Tens of millions of dollars in 1898, 99 are worth billions today.
In Butte, the news of the deal was hardly cause for rejoicing. The locals were shocked and scared.
The barons of Standard Oil, of course, had already made a very, very ugly reputation for themselves in the oil business in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and so on. So these men like Henry Rogers and William Rockefeller were reviled and were deeply distrusted.
Having sold out to ruthless Eastern robber barons, Daly was now wealthy beyond reckoning. But he wouldn't have long to enjoy his wealth. By the fall of 1900, he was dying.
He had diabetes, and he had gone to Germany for the cure. At that time, people believed that the spring waters in Germany, different places, had curative power. He came back to New York and was preparing to come home to Montana when he became real sick.
Daly never made it back to Montana. He died in New York in November of 1900. It was the end of an era in copper mining, an era when an uneducated immigrant could build an empire by natural genius and hard work. But Daly left an enduring mark. Anaconda would dominate the world copper market for decades. As for William Clark, his Senate career was short-lived. After just one term, Montana voters, disgusted by his shameless vote buying, sent Clark packing. Clark outlived Daly by 28 years. His mining and banking empire kept him one of America's richest men throughout his life. In the decades after Clark and Daly, the city of Butte fared badly. Labor strife, low copper prices, and soaring production costs put Butte into a slump that lasted for much of the 20th century. By the early 1980s, mining in Butte was history. Copper prices were in the cellar. And the famous Anaconda mine had become the infamous Berkeley Pit, a festering open sore steadily filling with toxic wastewater. Butte and Anaconda were identified as the nation's worst environmental mess.
I suspect by the time cleanup has been completed along the Clark Fork, we will spend upwards of perhaps $1 billion. Even 100 or 200 years from now, we'll still be dealing with some of the legacies of this cleanup, and some of the legacies may be here forever, such as the Berkeley Pit.
The landscape is changed forever, and you have to understand the balance of mining. Mining gives America great things: automobiles, mountain bikes, pretty jewelry, those sorts of things. But it leaves a terrible scar, and we have, as a community, had to deal with that.
But if Marcus Daly and William Clark left behind an environmental disaster, they left other things as well. An inspiring blueprint for any would-be tycoon. A classic tale of hard work, the American dream. Ruthless ambition and rags-to-riches success. A clash of colossal fortunes and titanic egos. That, too, is the legacy of the Copper Kings.
The Earth is quiet for now. We've been hit before, and there's